So I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to the Native Center for Behavioral Health. I am Ella Driscoll, and today Avis Garcia will be presenting Safe at Home Domestic Violence Awareness Series Part 1. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We are part of the MHTTC network out of Iowa City. In the next couple of days, we will send you a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording, a handout of the slides, and a CEU request instructions. We are a NADAC certified educational provider, and we are currently waiving fees for CEUs throughout the pandemic. Again, the follow-up email will contain instructions for ordering these CEUs. We will be sharing a link to our GIPRA survey at the end of our session today. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and asks about your satisfaction with this event. This feedback is critical to our future work, and we value your opinion and would greatly appreciate your time in sharing your thoughts with us. Today, you will be muted for the duration of this webinar. Please, please, please use the chat feature to share your questions and comments, and we will address them at points throughout the presentation. This project is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. This content is developed by the presenters, and the presenter and the opinions expressed do not reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native ATTC. And today we will be hearing from Avis Garcia. She is an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho Nation and affiliated with the Eastern Shoshone Tribe of Wyoming. She earned her doctorate in counselor education at the University of Wyoming, and she's a licensed professional counselor alongside a licensed addiction therapist. For 19 years, she has been a mental health provider in the treatment of Native American youth and families. With that, I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Garcia. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you. Okay.
Alrighty, let's jump into the slides in a moment. All right. Here we go.
Okay. 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 Is this on the first slide?
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Just a brief overview of what we're going to cover here today. This is highly educational session that I prepared for therapists and counselors. I often present to people that are not on the reservation, and when I worked for the Air Force, I was asked regularly to come and present on this topic of domestic and sexual violence. Victims of domestic and sexual violence suffer emotional, psychological, and physical abuse, all of that can result in acute and chronic signs and symptoms of physical and mental disease, illness, and injury. Frequently, the injuries sustained require abused victims to seek care from healthcare professionals immediately after their victimization. Subsequently, physicians and nurses are often the first healthcare providers that victims encounter and are in a critical position to identify victims in a variety of clinical practice settings where victims receive care. Today, I'm going to identify the common types of domestic and sexual violence, outline signs of abuse or victimization, describe the health effects and implications of domestic violence and/or sexual assault, including effects on pregnancy, developing fetuses, and child witnesses, evaluate the risk factors for and consequences of domestic and sexual violence in special populations, discuss traits of perpetrators and of domestic and/or sexual violence, and analyze screening and assessment methods to identify victims of abuse, and describe some appropriate responses, including best practices for follow-up and care. Because this is a series, I am focusing mostly on the educational aspects of domestic violence. And I'm going to do 3 sessions. This is the first session. The next session will focus more on domestic violence in Indian country from a Native American viewpoint. And I'll also look at how what's working and what helps, and maybe share some assessment tools in the next session. And the last session, I'm going to focus on effects that domestic violence has on children, and I'll share some evidence-based methods that have been proven effective to work in helping people with domestic violence issues. Okay, we can start the slides. What is domestic violence? Domestic violence is physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, threats to control children, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and isolation. And when I very first thought about domestic violence, my first reaction was that it was all physical abuse. I was totally unaware that there was psychological and emotional and financial abuse involved. So I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that today. We can go to the next slide. Domestic violence is termed spousal abuse, battering, or intimate partner violence, which is commonly used now, refers to the victimization of an individual with whom the abuser has or had an intimate romantic relationship. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention defines interpersonal violence as physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychologic aggression, including coercive acts by a current or former intimate partner, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, dating partner, or ongoing sexual partner. Okay, the physical abuse would involve a pattern of abusive behavior that keeps a person fearful for their own safety, which can also include withholding food, water, and shelter, and physical control by restraining, tying, handcuffing, blocking, locking in, taking car keys, or even clothing or shoes. And that also includes kicking, punching, biting, slapping, strangling, choking, abandoning in unsafe places, burning with cigarettes, throwing acid, throwing objects, refusing to help when sick, stabbing, and even shooting. You can go to the next slide. Physical abuse continued. Again, the hitting, punching, tearing clothing, breaking eyewear, spitting on, burning, hair pulling, throwing objects and cutting, threatening with a knife, gun, or other weapon, drugs and alcohol by force. Next slide. Psychological abuse convinces the person that they are worthless, hopeless, without help, powerless, and under the control of the abuser. Threats of harm to the victim, their children, or their loved ones. Stalking to the point of feeling very fearful. Manipulation of facts and ways of perceiving the truth, also known as gaslighting. You can go to the next slide. Sexual abuse includes rape, sexual coercion, forced viewing of pornography or other sexual activity, threat of control of children, providing false knowledge of how they could take the children legally, threats of leaving the area or the country with the children, and threats of harming the children. Emotional abuse, magnifying the victim's insecurities, insults in public and in private, degrading of character, giving messages that are not consistent, Financial abuse. As I said before, I entered into helping with domestic violence as a volunteer advocate. I began advocating for domestic violence in, I would say, the mid-2000s. And this financial abuse was a new one to me, and one that I actually experienced personally. And I wasn't even aware that this was a form of abuse until I took the domestic violence course training to be an advocate. And this includes maintaining tight control of money, withholding the truth about finances, or it can also include exploiting finances of an elderly or a dependent adult. Can go to the next slide. Another form of abuse is isolation. That's a total lack of autonomy. No, they don't have the freedom to go where they want and when they want. They're basically almost like a prison in their own home most of the time. There's tight control over who can be seen, where, and for how long, and convincing them that they belong only to the abuser, that basically they consider them to be, the abusers consider them to be property. You can go to the next slide. Some statistics on intimate partner violence. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. However, most of today's presentation will focus on violence against women. And it's not just women that are victims. There are a lot of men who are victims. And working in the substance abuse field as long as I have for almost 2 decades now, I have seen men who have been abused and are victims, and I have also worked with women who are charged with those domestic violence charges. You can go to the next slide. The victims, like I said, a majority are women, children, men. They come from all ages, education levels, ethnicities, socioeconomic levels, cultures, and religions. The victim continued some of the characteristics that can be related to their problems that they struggle with as a victim is low self-esteem, which can occur over a long period of abuse. Their self-esteem begins to wear down. Many have poor support systems. They are dependent on the perpetrator, oftentimes financially, for, to take care of the children and to have a home. And they may lack coping skills, and they may be unaware of resources that are available to help them leave that situation. The victim continued, they often want the abuse to end, but not the relationship. They often feel isolated, they can be depressed, act helpless, and also be embarrassed about the situation that they're in. The victim continued, they fear judgment and stigmatization, and they may deny or minimize the abuse. They still love their abuser. They are emotionally withdrawn, and they may distance themselves from family and friends. As I said, they may feel a lot of guilt and shame regarding the circumstance that they're facing. They can be highly anxious, not knowing when the next abusive event will occur, because it tends to occur in a cyclic format. They may also have suicidal thoughts or attempts. Many abuse drugs and alcohol. Like I said, working as a substance abuse counselor for as long as I have, I think almost every time I present domestic violence to our women that are clients, they often disclose that they have been in a domestic violence situation. Some of them are suffering with PTSD as a result of it. And many of them, their coping method has been use of drugs and alcohol. And then they also hope that their abuser will change. They fall into that cycle of believing them when there's the honeymoon period of that things are going to get better, which lasts only briefly. You can go to the next slide. Okay. The abuser, their main objective is domination and control. This often occurs in cycles that include good times and peace, followed by periods of abuse. Their patterns of abuse intensify as the time goes on and the abuse escalates. 90% of the abusers have no criminal records and are law-abiding citizens. There is no one typical detectable personality of an abuser. However, they do often display common characteristics. An abuser often denies the existence of or minimizes the seriousness of the violence and its effect on the victim and other family members. An abuser objectifies the victim and often sees them as their property or sexual objects. An abuser externalizes the causes of their behavior. They blame their violence on circumstances such as stress, their partner's behavior, a bad day, on alcohol, drugs, or other factors. An abuser has low self-esteem and feels powerless and ineffective in the world. He or she may appear successful, but internally feel inadequate. The abuser manipulates to appear loving, caring, and attentive, especially in the beginning and also during the good times in the abuse cycle. In public, they are often charming, successful, and well-liked. They appear attentive and devoted to their victims, family, and friends, so they know how to put on a good show when there are other people present. And they also like that no one knows there. They think nobody knows what they're doing. You can change to the next slide. The abuser characteristics also include being extremely jealous and possessive, blame the victim for causing the abuse. They may be cruel to animals, be extremely controlling, and have rigid beliefs about women and children. They are particularly interested in guns and weapons. Oftentimes, some of the abusers have already been charged with domestic violence more than once, and as part of that sentence, they are usually told not to have any guns or any type of weapons, but they don't always abide by the law and they get access to them somehow. They can be forceful, domineering, and aggressive, and highly vigilant, and they never assume blame. They don't want to take any responsibility for what's going on. And to the victim's reaction to abuse, they are coping, placating, enduring, and basically they're just accepting the situation because many have low self-esteem and they feel hopeless. They oftentimes don't see a way out to end that situation. They may be managing, anticipating the abuser's mood and modifying their own behaviors so as not to arouse anger and diverting attention. So they're typically walking on eggshells knowing that violence could erupt at any moment. They may be resisting, creating consequences such as an arrest, seeking outside help, or hitting back, or striking preemptively. So they may be on some level trying to resist what is happening to them. Domestic violence affects all aspects of a person's life. It affects the entire family, and it also affects the entire community. I've seen some questions pop up in the chat box, and I'm going to get to those after the presentation here. We also have some questions that we want to ask. I was sharing with the ladies before we got on today that when I do presentations, I do a lot of research as I create my presentations, and the research that I was finding is really outdated. It comes from the early 2000s. It also has that deficit perspective on Native Americans and is written and done by people who are not Native American. So a lot of work as far as research for Native Americans needs to be done. My second presentation will highlight all of that information. One of the questions was asking about the prevalence of domestic violence for Native Americans. And if you'll attend the next session that I'll have next week, I'll get more into that. When we talk about the community, I was visiting my daughter's place this last weekend, and she's going to school at the university. And I picked up the newspaper from back home, the Wind River newspaper. I'm from the Wind River Reservation here in Wyoming. And I was sad to see that the newspaper, one of the front page stories was of someone who is facing domestic violence charges at a very young age. And sadly, it was not this perpetrator's first time to be charged. So I'm sitting there reading this article of someone young at home and thinking of the young woman and the children in the home of, man, that has to be so traumatic for the women and the children involved, and that this has happened not only not one time, but 3 or 4 times. And the perpetrators, I mean, this is why we'll have questions at the end, is I don't feel where I come from that there's any intervention being done that is effective, because they can learn to unlearn those behaviors. And I just really feel bad. Sadly, that wasn't the only story in my newspaper from the reservation. It had a second story, another story inside the paper, another domestic violence case, serious charges, serious abuse. The girl had been strangled. She could have been killed. And a lot of what brings me to working with domestic violence and sparked my interest was in 2005, my own mother was a victim of domestic violence, and she was killed by the partner she was with at the time. And so my work that I do here is to honor my mother. I feel that if I help people that are in that situation, maybe I can educate people, maybe I can increase awareness, maybe I can reach that one person to give them what they need to get the courage to leave that situation if they're able to. So that's why I'm pretty pumped about this series. So we can go on to the next slide. And then talking more about news during this coronavirus period, I've been watching the news here in Cheyenne where I work, and the domestic violence cases have been pretty regular and frequent in the news here, and this is off the reservation. Resistive and reactive violence. This is when the victim starts to react back, and the target is the abuser. And it's often a means to stop the abuse or escape. It is a form of revenge or retaliation. It's seen as a way to reclaim or restore dignity. Sadly, oftentimes it ends very badly, and we'll talk more about that later. We can go to the next slide. The perpetrator has a key to their own protection by stopping their violence against the victims. And that's all they have to do is stop being violent to their partner. Violence is rarely the first or only tactic used by victims. Victims, may start to make plans to leave that situation by maybe preparing the children or planning to set some money aside for themselves to leave, and maybe how they're going to call the police and report what's going on. But sadly, a lot of times, not just in Indian country, many women don't even call for help. You can go to the next slide. Primary or other tactics used by victims can be negotiations, appeasement, threatening to withdraw from the relationship, maybe planning on getting divorced, soliciting help from others, threats to expose the offender to others. Maybe this might be some person who is in the community in a high position, and they're like, people don't know what's going on, and what will they do if I tell them this, what's really going on here? So they start to find ways to get back. And then they also have threats to hurt the offender in some way. And oftentimes they do. Next slide. And then there's violence by both partners. The victim's use of violence ends when the abuser's violence ends, when the relationship ends. The abuser will continue to abuse indefinitely and often more intensely as they feel the loss of control over their victim, either within the relationship or when it ends. This is when the victim is in the most serious danger. Here's some statistics. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. So every minute that is going on that clock, someone is being a victim somewhere. During 1 year, this equates to 10 million people. On a typical day, more than 20,000 calls are placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. Go to the next slide. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crimes. Women between the ages of 18 and 24 are most commonly the victim. %19 of domestic violence involves the use of a weapon. Domestic victimization is correlated with a higher rate of depression and suicidal behavior. So a lot of times, some of the women you may see as a therapist in your agency, wherever you work, when there is depression, that may be something that you want to look at further. A lot of women are more willing to come in and report depression versus that they're in an abusive relationship. About 34% of people injured by intimate partners receive medical care for their injuries. Not everyone goes and gets help. A lot of these people endure the pain and suffering that they received as a result of the abuse that they endured. And so emergency rooms and hospitals are probably places where you're going to see that most often. Physicians and nurses are trained to screen for domestic violence. I have migraines, and I want to say at least once a year I end up in the emergency room because sometimes my medications won't work or I can't keep them down. And every time I'm always asked if I'm in an abusive relationship. And I used to be a little annoyed by that, but now that I'm doing this research, I'm like, well, I'm glad they're doing their job and they're asking those questions. Let me go to the next slide. Rape. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men in the United States have been raped in their lifetime. And about half, 46.7% of female and 44.9% of male victims of rape in the United States were raped by an acquaintance. Of these, 45.4% female and 29% male victims were raped by an intimate partner. Stalking, also another form of domestic violence that, I never really thought about. 19.3 million women and 5.1 million men in the United States have been stalked in their lifetime. 60.8% female and 43.5% male victims of stalking were stalked by a former or a current partner. So even though they may have escaped that situation, the perpetrator may go to extremes and follow this person some way, any way that they can. Homicide. A study of intimate partner homicides found that 20% of the victims were not the intimate partner, but family members, friends, neighbors, persons who intervened, law enforcement responders, or bystanders. So somebody may just be trying to help save the victim and they're the ones who get killed in trying to help someone. %72 of all murder and suicides involve an intimate partner. Oftentimes you see on TV that the perpetrator will kill their whole family. They'll kill the wife, they'll kill the children, and then they know they're going to face some consequences. So out of fear, they kill themselves as well. And these kinds of cases most often make the news. 94% of the victims of the murder-suicides are females. So that's a big, huge number of them. Children. 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year in the United States. 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to the violence. Children who live with domestic violence are at increased risk to become direct victims of child abuse. Some of the children's reactions to this domestic violence, if any of you are familiar with the ACE scores that looks at children's adverse childhood experiences, is a little screening test that you can give people to assess trauma that they've experienced in their lifetime. And in working with substance abuse, I often use that screening tool as a group session, and several people often share that they can check many of those experiences that they've had personally, which can include generalized anxiety, sleeplessness, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, and high activity levels. So we often don't really think when children are having problems that maybe we need to think what's going on at home, and maybe we need to take that child aside and see, how they're doing physically at home. We can go to the next slide. Children's reaction may also include increased aggression towards others, or a regression to separation anxiety. They may fear their mom leaving or their caretaker leaving them. They may have intense worry about the safety of their parent. Some of the long-term effects on children, especially from chronic long-term exposure, can be physical health problems, behavior problems in adolescence, juvenile delinquency, alcohol and substance abuse, have emotional difficulties in adulthood, such as depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD. And this PTSD, like I shared with you earlier, is pretty common in a lot of the people that come to my agency for drug and alcohol counseling or any treatment center that I've been in. Some of them are in that situation now. With this COVID, a lot of my work went online and we started Zooming our groups. And it wasn't too long ago that I had one of the females not turn her camera on so that we could see her. And I told her, can you turn your camera on so that I can see you? We can't see you. And she had sent me a little text message, and she said, I'll talk to you when this is over. And so I was like, okay. Sadly, when it was over, she turned the camera on and she had black eyes, and she had been badly physically assaulted by her partner. And I felt so bad that, I was like, your camera's not on. Why don't you turn it on? So it is important that we're able to see them so that we can get them the help that they need. You can go to the next slide. Domestic violence poses a serious threat to children's emotional, psychological, and physical well-being, particularly if the violence is chronic. Children may learn that it is acceptable to exert control or relieve stress by using violence, or that violence is linked to expressions of intimacy and affection. You can go to the next slide. Domestic violence also has an economic impact on the country. Victims of intimate partner violence lose a total of 8 million days of paid work each year in the United States. So they may not be able to go to work because they're physically in pain, or they don't want anyone to see their bruises. The cost of domestic violence exceeds $8.3 billion per year. So if you look at the medical costs, some of these women that have to leave and they have to go into shelters, maybe they have children that also have needs. Some of them end up homeless as a result of domestic violence. And sadly, a couple of weeks ago, I had someone from my own reservation in this town who came here with her children to escape a domestic violence situation. And I was so glad that the school that her son was attending was able to connect them to some resources that were able to help. You can go to the next slide. More on this economic impact. Between 2003 and 2008, 142 women were murdered in their workplace by their abuser. 78% of the women killed in the workplace during this time. Between 21 to 60% of the victims lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from the abuse. How can we help? I would encourage and support the client where they are. Do not pressure them to leave. They will need to be prepared to have a safety plan to leave, because like I said earlier, it's the most dangerous time in the relationship for them. It's also important to give them resources and education. so that they're able to access what they need when they're ready to go. To the next slide. As a domestic violence advocate, I did help women, and I did see them go back home, because I would go back to my next day of volunteer work, and I would say, where is so-and-so? They're like, oh, she went back home. And so I would be, a little sad, but it happens many times. Many go back. It's very important to give them the resources that they need to access the help that they can get. We have some questions that we want to ask at the end of this to take a poll. And like I said, as I was doing my research, a lot of it is outdated, and I'm looking for what's going on in Indian country across the country, because as I shared with you, I feel that my community back home is really struggling with ongoing domestic violence, and it is young women and young men that are engaged in the violent relationships. And I know that there's children involved, and I really feel like more used to be done than is being done now. And I have a friend who lost, 2 of her daughters in this last year. One of them, was just opened her door and was shot as she opened her door. And her other daughter, and this is what was so hard for me, was she's a friend who's my age who lost 2 of her daughters in 1 year. And, the other one was found out in the cold. She still doesn't know what happened to her. And I really feel that, more needs to be done there. And so this is some resources that people can reach out to. Most places have a safe house. Where I come from on the reservation, there's currently no programming taking place on the reservation, so our women are being referred to safe houses that are in the towns that are nearby the reservation. And so many of them are a little bit reluctant to go there because they just don't feel comfortable doing so. Is that the last slide?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
We do have some questions. Someone asked, do you have the specific stats for Native Americans compared to the general population?
I don't have those right at the moment. I do know that Native Americans face 3 to 7 times higher any violent act, domestic violence. Domestic violence is probably the 4th leading cause of death for Native American women. My next presentation, I'm going to be really focused on Native Americans, so I hope you'll attend that session because I'm really going to get into the Native population next week.
Someone asked, do you feel that perpetrators are getting younger than in the past?
I want to say yes. I have a friend whose daughter turned 16 this last spring, and she had a boyfriend, and she kept going to the boyfriend's house, and all of a sudden she didn't want to go to the boyfriend's house anymore. And mom was like, really thinking something's going on here because her daughter was very quiet, all of a sudden real withdrawn. And she seen her daughter coming out of the shower, going to her bedroom, and she saw marks on her body. And of course, being a concerned mom, she pried and asked her daughter to see what was on her body and how did that get there. This young man had bitten her all over her body, and she was 16 years old. My friend, she knows I'm a counselor, so of course she calls me right away to ask me what she should do. And this is, again, I feel like our policing on our reservation has gotten really bad. I just feel like so much could be done and it's not being done because the mom did call the police and she did file charges. And as far as we know, we don't know what's happened. several women on our reservation I knew back when I was there working and helping alongside one of my aunts was when we had a program, was a lot of the women were afraid to go to the court because sometimes the perpetrator's whole family would go to court with them. And so they were afraid of being attacked by the family members. So when you're on the reservation and you have a problem with the family, we have such extended families, a lot of times the whole family gets involved, you know. Sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. So I've seen that happen as well.
We had an interesting question. The women I work with are all asked to give a code word that when texted to me, I know that they need help and are in danger at the time. Do you have systems like this? Or do you think more people should be doing this?
Well, that's why we're going to ask these questions that we have. I don't know what's going on across the country. I haven't given any code words to anyone other than helping them make safety plans, which is, you know, where they're going to go, who they're going to call. I mean, a lot of work needs to go into the planning of when they're ready to leave and how they're going to get out. A lot of times there's children involved, so they may also need to get the children ready to leave the situation that they're going to be in. So that's why we're going to ask these questions. And I have a number that I give my clients. I created a Google number, and this is for my clients so that they can call me, text me anytime if they need me. As a substance abuse counselor, you know, I'm you know, there to help them if they're feeling like they want to use a substance, but then I'm also there if they're facing an intimate partner that is being physically abusive or emotionally abusive or financially abusive. Like I shared with you guys, when I was young, I didn't even know that there were other forms of domestic violence because I experienced the psychological and mental abuse. I experienced the financial abuse. And my partner at the time, he was actually getting his PhD in counseling just like I have. So and I see people back home that are my own family members that I know have engaged in domestic violence, but they have these really good jobs. And, you know, so sometimes it's really hard. That's why I feel more needs to be done, which is why I feel increasing awareness. I feel our young women, like I said, my friend's daughter was only 16 years old. I really feel that domestic violence awareness needs to happen in the high schools and in the junior highs. Maybe, you know, children, you know, a little older that can say, hey, you know, something's going on in my home and my mom needs help, or I'm scared because maybe we won't ask. So I saw a lot of that myself growing up. So I know how it can affect someone, and I'll share more of that in the next presentation that is focused on Native people, because how I got my help and support was through my cultural traditions that we have back at home.
Yeah, for sure. Someone said, do you think that there may be a link with violence among younger people and violence in the media, especially when it comes to pornography?
Comes to what?
Specifically pertaining to pornography.
I would say yes. I have been hearing more and more people in the community of children as young as 6, 7 years old watching pornography, because you can find it on your phone. It's everywhere. And I really feel that it exploits women. And they're just seen as objects to be abused. And, you know, the women that engage in that just what that message that gives to other people. And, you know, sadly, that pornography is just exploded. You know, I get clients who are coming in for treatment because they're addicted to pornography. And so it's just really changed a lot of the work that I do. So I really feel that there has to be some sort of connection there, especially when it comes to sexual violence. I think, and I went to a conference, about a year ago before this hit, and I was really shocked that a lot of young people are engaging in like sex parties and sex acts with multiple people. So that they're not aware of that. And I've also worked with girls who didn't even realize that they've been sexually abused until I get to spend more time with them and they disclose more information. And being a mandatory reporter, I have to report that. So a lot of these girls didn't realize, because they were, somewhat willingly participating, they were being abused because maybe this person was older and they were doing things that they really weren't comfortable doing, and they weren't old enough to make that decision legally.
Yeah. Someone asks, what are some tips to not enable when speaking with the victim?
I will say my third session, I'm going to get more into that. One way, like I said, a lot of them are going to go back many times, because he might buy flowers, he might promise the moon and the stars, and because she wants that relationship and still has hopes of love and this happy family, that she will go back. So to not enable her would maybe have her keep a calendar and start documenting, educate her about the cycle of abuse, which I'll share in my next session of power and control, and how they go through, it builds up to the honeymoon stage and to the violent, explosive stage where the physical violence happens at its worst. And once they realize that it is a cycle, and understanding where they come from, that maybe that's going to help them realize that it's not going to get better, and they need to start thinking about themselves and what they're going to do to get out of that situation, not only for themselves. If there's children involved, I'm always really concerned about their safety as well. But I want to say, on a positive note, I have had young couples that I've worked with on the reservation, and I feel that with some intervention and some education, that we can help these abusers look at their lifestyle, because they probably came from that kind of background. And I have seen couples work things out and get better, and make their young family life better, once the guy admitted that, because the woman did tell me, he does that to me, he does those things to me, and what should we do? And when they're both sitting there in treatment side by side, and I think it was really brave of the girl to speak up in a group session with, I don't know, we probably had 20 people in the room. But the guy didn't leave. He actually participated in the counseling session, and that doesn't happen often. Most men don't want to participate in that. And there are some things that can be done to help. So just giving them education and all the support that they can get.
Yeah. Someone commented, I don't feel like they do things with the perpetrator as far as healing their trauma and fixing their behaviors. They are not helped either, even if they go to jail.
No, they're not. Like I said, when I was reading the newspaper this last weekend, it just like put a knot in my stomach, because one of these people, he's very young, like in his early 20s, and he's probably going to go to prison for felony domestic violence. And it's like, this wasn't the first time. That's what gets me, is like, why aren't we helping these young men the first time, and instead of letting this happen again and again and again? These two women, they're very young, and they're lucky to be alive right now. And the same for the women. I'm like, I've had this happen to me in a different place, domestic violence situation, sadly. I share with people that, I had to get tough myself, and I had to walk away from some situations and take some risks to take care of myself and my children. But I was in an area with my ex-husband, and they actually called me and asked me questions, and I did call the police, and he did tell me I was doing things to him in his job, and I'm like, no, it's not me. You're the one that's doing this, and I'm not going to take that. I'm not going to allow you to do that. But that program actually called me and checked in with me regularly. They offered me free counseling services. They said it was free. So I was like, yeah, I'll take some free counseling. Again, this was when I was really young and I was uneducated. And when I lost my mother to domestic violence, it felt for me that if I could help somebody like I said, to me, I'm honoring my mother. She was 42 years old when she passed. And of course, she was involved with alcohol pretty heavily, and it had, it contributes to that. Alcohol is not a contributing factor, but it is a correlative factor to domestic violence. It does not cause domestic violence, and some men will use that as, well, I was drinking. If I wasn't drinking, or if I wasn't high on drugs, I wouldn't have done that. But that doesn't cause it. The real thing is, without that, it's still going to happen. But it takes women being able to stand up and realize. And I swore when my mother left that I was never going to allow anyone to abuse me in my life and give my children a better life. So I feel like I've done a pretty good job of doing that. And I continue to help people. And that's, for me, makes me feel better. And I just turned 55 last month. So I always say I'm living for my mom, because her life ended so soon, and I was pretty young then, and I was a single mom when she left. So it was a traumatic experience for me, and I had to get help. And fortunately, being raised by my grandparents, I had access to our ceremonies that were the most powerful thing that helped me and continues to help me and keep me grounded to this day.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and your passion shows in your work, and it really means so much that you're here today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow. Sorry. Oh, I'm just so, that's very powerful and really touches me personally. So thank you for sharing that. Someone said, I work in a tribal jail, and some of the inmates do want to break the cycle. I'm a counselor there, and a lot of them do it because it's what they know. We have programs for them, but it's up to them to change. Maybe not all tribes have these options while in jail or prison. Yeah.
Like I said, I see our jail is just a tiny little jail on our reservation, and I wish they had a big one so that they could stay there a little longer, and maybe we did go in there and provide some counseling and some intervention and some work with them. And when I got my master's degree, my master's project, and I remember we were talking about people we would not want to work with and we would not want to help. And at that time in my life was like, I don't want to work with men that do domestic violence, And I actually, with the help of my mentor, for my project to graduate, the paper that I wrote was the creation of a domestic violence program that is for the man, and how we could educate them and help them not be violent to women. And that alone was like a life-changing process for me. So I'm not afraid to run my men's treatment groups and talk about domestic violence openly to them and tell them, whatever you're doing, stop it. Do you want to take anger management group? We have anger management group here. We can put you in that. And, not all of them participate. And, I've confronted some men in my group I had one guy who just criticized his girlfriend openly in the group. And I told him, do you do this at home? And he's like, he didn't know what to say. And to me, that was yes, but without saying yes. And I said, you have a daughter. And I told him, I said, you're teaching her that this is how life is. Is that what you want to teach your daughter? And now I feel like he's, not because of me, but I think he's really looked at himself and he's trying to make some changes for himself. And he's in one of our court-ordered programs, but I really feel like having some help has really helped him look at that. So I bring that up openly with, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I let our counselors know, hey, let's have some presentations and let's talk about this month.
Yeah, right. And it's definitely like helpful, like to know that even with the perpetrators, like you should still, even though it's difficult because, you're like, oh, they're wrong. Like they still need help too. They're wounded and that's why they hurt others. And so these programs are so important, even though it may be hard for some people, it is needed for sure. Mm-hmm. And that's how we start changing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Little by little, sadly, this has been brought to light in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and still the numbers don't go down. The numbers still continue to stay where they are. And like I said, it crosses all races, boundaries, economic statuses. It is everywhere.
I see we're just about to finish, so I just want to say thank you so much for presenting, and thank you for all the work you do. And again, thank you for sharing your stories today. I feel very, very special being able to be here today with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day, and we will see you next week in part 2.
I'll focus more on Native Americans next week, so I hope you come back.
See you, everyone.